The government is a plain, simple, intelligent thing, founded in nature and reason, quite comprehensible by common sense. The true source of our suffering has been our timidity. We have been afraid to think. Let us dare to read, think, speak, and write. Let it be known that British liberties are not the grants of princes or parliaments, that many of our rights are inherent and essential, agreed on as maxims and established as preliminaries, even before Parliament existed. Let us read and recollect and impress upon our souls the views and ends of our more immediate forefathers in exchanging their native country for a dreary, inhospitable wilderness. Recollect their amazing fortitude, their bitter sufferings, the hunger, the nakedness, the cold which they patiently endured, the severe labors of clearing their ground, building their houses, raising their provisions, amidst dangers from wild beasts and savage men, before they had time or money or materials for commerce. Recollect the civil and religious principles and hopes and expectations which constantly supported and carried them through all hardships with patience and resignation. Let us recollect it was liberty, the hope of liberty, for themselves and us and ours, which conquered all discouragements, dangers, and trials. Hello history friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name's Lisa. I am an American historian, and here on Historical USA we discover the people, places, and events that have made America. As Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty took to the streets in protest, some took a more diplomatic and political approach to combating the Stamp Act. In this episode, we are going to talk about those men who decided to take to the pen instead of the street, and the beginning of a unified colonial front with the meeting of the Stamp Act Congress. Now, before we jump into the episode, I just want to shout out Mackenzie, our newest Patreon member. Thank you so much, Mackenzie, for your support. If you would like to support me in my work here, you can also go and visit me over on Patreon and join one of the 2 tiers. You will get early access and a few other exclusive content over there as well. And you can find the book club over there as well if you are interested in joining the Historical USA book club. The book club is free to join. You do not have to be a member. We have a good time over there. Thank you, Mackenzie, so much for your support. James Otis would visit his sister and brother-in-law, the Warrens, in Plymouth, Massachusetts that May, after news of the Stamp Act had reached Massachusetts shores. Now, his brother-in-law was James Warren, who was also a member of the Massachusetts legislature. And Otis had an idea, and his idea was of an intercolonial convention to marshal forces against this Stamp Act. Now, Mercy and James Warren enthusiastically agreed on the need for a joint action. The results of their discussion, according to contemporary historian William Gordon, was the idea of the Stamp Act Congress. Now, Mercy Otis Warren, one of the first American Revolutionary historians, wrote of her brother that it was he who proposed the Stamp Act Congress on the floors of the General Court just days after discussing the idea with her and her husband James. Quote, "In this period of suspension, apprehension, and anxiety, a general congress of delegates from these several provinces were proposed by the Honorable James Otis of Barnstable in Massachusetts. He was a gentleman of great property, experience, and parliamentary abilities, whose religious adherence to the rights of his country had distinguished him through the long course of years in which he had sustained some of the first offices in government. This proposal from a man of his acknowledged judgment, discretion, and firmness was universally pleasing. The measure was communicated to some of the principal members of the two houses of assembly and immediately adopted, not only by the Massachusetts, but very soon by most of the other colonies. As the colonies debated an invitation to Otis's proposed meeting of colonial delegates, violence had broken out in Boston. News of the Stamp Act riots inspired other violent demonstrations up and down the eastern seaboard, from Charleston, South Carolina to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Chapters of the Sons of Liberty had chosen their local liberty trees, and they too began threatening the local stamp man in effigy. One colonist from South Carolina wrote, quote, "The effigies were exhibited on gallows the whole day, the greatest pleasure of the inhabitants in general, then taken down and carted through the street until they came to the stamp man's door, where they supposed the stamp papers were lodged, broke his windows, then proceeded to the suburbs of the town, and consumed the effigies. Amidst the acclamation of a large concourse of people, George Saxby, the South Carolina stamp distributor, has resigned that office. At the exhibition of a stamp man's effigy at Halifax were the following labels. On the stamp man's breast was affixed his confession, 'Behold me hanging on this cursed tree. Example to those who would stamp men be. It was for the sake of gain I took this place. The more the shame, oh pity my sad case. Bute was the author of this cursed act, and what I say, you may depend, is fact. But alas, the devil is too sly. Instead of gain, has left me here to die. Whoever carries this away is an enemy to his country. What greater glory can this country see than a stamp master hanging on a tree?' On the pocket of one effigy, a repentant speech, quote, 'Oh, mourn me, my poor and wretched state. I now repent, but alas, too late. America I fought to overthrow, by stamping them to death, you all must know. But pity overthrew my schemes, did me confound, and brought my favorite Stamp Act to the ground.' As the mobs consumed Boston, a young Boston lawyer condemned the acts of violence in his city. A 30-year-old John Adams, encouraged by a colleague, political activist John Gridley, published his first extended political work of his life in the Boston Gazette that August. Originally published untitled, it would later become known as a dissertation on the canon and the feudal law. Unlike his second cousin, Samuel Adams, John did not call for more mob violence, as he would come to detest the antics of the Sons of Liberty, never really joining their cause or organization. Historian David McCullough would write in his biography of the third president, John Adams, the Stamp Act was hardly mentioned. Rather, the dissertation was a statement of his own fervent patriotism and the taproot conviction that American freedoms were not ideals still to be obtained, but rights long and firmly established by British law and by their courage and sacrifices of generations of Americans. Adams wrote in his dissertation that liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it, derived from our Maker. But if we have not, our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasures, and their blood. And liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people who have a right from the frame of their nature to knowledge, as their great Creator, who does nothing in vain, has given them understandings and a desire to know. But besides this, we have a right, an indisputable, unalienable, indefeasible, divine right to the most dreaded and envied kind of knowledge. I mean of the character and conduct of their rulers. McCullough explained, quote, he was calling on his readers for independence of thought, to know their own minds, Adams was praised throughout the colony for his dissertation. Now, this is the first time we see John Adams step out and begin to build his reputation as a political leader. It is here, throughout the summer and spring of 1765, where John Adams takes a front row seat in the events leading to the Revolution. He will become a leader of the Continental Congress and instrumental in establishing the birth of a new nation. McAuliffe writes further, quote, "Now fully joined in Boston's political ferment, Adams was meeting with Gridley, James Otis, Samuel Adams, and others. Observing them closely, he concluded that it was his older second cousin, Samuel Adams, who had, quote, the most understanding of liberty, end quote. Samuel Adams was, quote, zealous and keen in the cause of steadfast integrity, a universally good character, end quote. The esteemed Otis, however, had begun to act strangely. He was liable to great iniquities of temper, sometimes in despondency, sometimes in rage, Adams recorded in dismay. Now, as James Otis, his mental state began to take a turn. He would continue to fall back more into the shadows of the revolutionary cause. But he would be one of 3 Massachusetts representatives selected for the Stamp Act Congress to be convened in New York that October of 1765. Now, the other 2 representatives from Massachusetts would be allies to the Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. That would be Timothy Ruggles and John Cotton, the Deputy Secretary of the Massachusetts General Court. Now, only 9 of the colonies even agreed to send delegates. That would be Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and South Carolina. All the delegates that were selected were members of their colonial legislative bodies. Now, the colonies that were not represented at the Congress did not send delegates for a variety of reasons. Now, the Virginia and Georgia assemblies were deliberately prevented from meeting by their governors. New Hampshire chose not to send delegates because of the ongoing financial crisis they had in their colony. Now, unfortunately, by the time some assembly members sought to reconsider that decision, the assembly had adjourned. Now, North Carolina's Lieutenant Governor, William Tryon, refused to call North Carolina back into a special session to discuss the Stamp Act Congress, even though there were public protests and opposition to that act by Speaker John Ashe. Now, Nova Scotia declined to send delegates despite significant economic connections to Massachusetts and a strong presence of expatriated New Englanders in its assembly. Dominated by financial interests connected to England, the assembly never even considered a protest resolution against the Stamp Act. Quebec, Newfoundland, and East and West Florida did not have colonial assemblies at the time and were not invited. Now, when word of the pending Congress reached London, the Lords of Trade were so disturbed that they wrote to the king that, quote, this is a matter of the utmost importance to the kingdom and legislature of Great Britain, and proper only for the consideration of Parliament, end quote. Communications were so slow that when Parliament was informed about the existence of the Stamp Act Congress, it was already in session. Trade commissioners also noted that, quote, this appears to us to be the first instance of any general Congress appointed by the assemblies of the colonies without the authority of the Crown, a measure which we conceive of dangerous tendency in itself, end quote. Now, the first session of Congress was held on October 7th at New York City Hall, today known as Federal Hall. The Congress chose Timothy Ruggles, an actor of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, as its chairman, narrowly defeating James Otis, whom John Adams regarded as the soul of that body. Now, the Massachusetts delegation selected John Cotton, the deputy secretary, to maintain a formal record and was appointed as the body's secretary and record keeper. Ruggles, his appointment as delegate was purposely orchestrated by Massachusetts Loyalist Governor Francis Bernard to limit the Congress's effectiveness. Ruggles' success in being elected chairman was at least partly because of the perception that Otis, a populist firebrand, quote, might give their meeting an ill grace, end quote. The Stamp Act Congress held its regular meetings behind closed doors, but part of the business may have been taken in informal sessions held in coffeehouses and other venues in the evenings. New York's Lieutenant Governor, Cadwalader Colden, unable to prevent the meeting, called it an illegal convention, noted, quote, whatever possible pretense may be used for this meeting, their real intentions may be dangerous, end quote. The delegates were clear that they were loyal to the crown. New York delegate Robert Livingston wrote that the Congress was designed to ensure the unity of the British Empire. Quote, if I wish to see America in a state of independence, I should desire as one of the most effectual means to that end that the Stamp Act should be enforced, end quote. Side note, Robert Livingston was one of the 5 selected to help write the Declaration of Independence later on. Just keep that in mind. Little is known really about the debate in the Stamp Act Congress. The official congressional records really had only brief descriptions of official actions, and only William Samuel Johnson, one of the participants, kept a private journal. As a result, congressional accounts are dependent on fragmented evidence from contemporary letters and publications. In addition to selecting officers, the inaugural sessions evaluated each delegates' credentials. Despite the unconventional methods used to choose some, no delegates were dismissed. They also argued how the body's voting should be conducted, eventually resolving that each delegation should cast one vote. The early substantial arguments focused on issues posed by the Stamp Act and the older Sugar Act. The delegates spent an extensive amount of time examining the distinctions between direct, internal taxation, and trade regulation, or external taxation, as well as finding formal justification for the notion that only colonial assemblies had the authority to levy internal taxes. Early in the deliberations, the delegates resolved to draft a statement of rights, which would serve as the framework for petitions to Parliament and the King. According to Delaware delegate Caesar Rodney, the drafting of the statement was made difficult by the desire to balance the colonists' rights with the royal prerogative and the acknowledged powers of Parliament. On October 19th, the delegates passed the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a text designed largely for local political debate. Over the next several days, 3 documents were drafted by independent committees: an address to the King, a memorial to the House of Lords, and an appeal to the House of Commons. Separate committees worked over the next 4 days to prepare these, which the delegates approved after debate and revision on October 22nd and 23rd. When the subject of signing the documents arose on October 24th, things grew more complex. Now, the delegates from Connecticut and South Carolina flat out refused to sign the documents, citing their instructions specifically denying such power from their own legislatures. New York's delegates also refused, citing the informality with which it had been selected. From the other 6 delegations, New Jersey's Robert Ogden and Massachusetts' Ruggles both refused to sign, sparking a very heated argument. Ruggles eventually moved that no one sign the documents, and that they instead be sent unsigned to the colonial assemblies. Otis then pointed out that Massachusetts Assembly had authorized its delegates to sign any jointly agreed documents, and that Ruggles' suggestion undermined the purpose of the Congress to present a unified front. Although the other delegates from the 6 colonies signed the petitions, Ruggles and Ogden did not. Ruggles, in his defense, admitted he was opposed to the substance of the documents, and Ogden argued weakly that he thought separate petitions would be more effective than a joint one, even though others had noted that Parliament had already ignored such petitions. Ruggles and future signer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas McKean, even had an angry exchange over the matter, resulting in Ruggles challenging McKean to a duel. The duel did not take place, at least not in known record, and Ruggles left New York early the next morning. The Congress met again on October 25th, when the petitions were signed and arrangements were made for the transmission of some of the documents to England and the making of copies for the colonies that did not participate. When copies reached London, Lord Dartmouth, the colonial secretary, rejected the petition to the Lords, saying it was an inappropriate document. The House of Commons cited several reasons not to consider the petition, including that it had been submitted by an unconstitutional assembly and denied Parliament's right to levy taxes, and acceptance of the petition would constitute an admission that Parliament had erred. At this point, Grenville had already been kicked out of office, and a new prime minister, Lord Rockingham, he rallied merchants' interests in opposition to the Stamp Act, and it was repealed primarily on the strength of economic arguments advanced by these interests on March 18th, 1766. And the truth is, really, when it came down to money, the Stamp Act cost far much more for England to enforce it than the revenue it was meant to bring in. Now, the Stamp Act Congress did not accomplish what it intended to. However, what it did do was respected delegates from different colonies sat down together and debated openly for the first time. They learned that they had more in common than they had previously imagined. This is an uneasy, but it was an essential step toward the unity required to boldly declare independence from England as a whole. Its meetings is the foundation of the First and Second Continental Congress. And though the Stamp Act was eventually repealed, to address those constitutional issues raised by the North American protesters, Parliament would then pass the Declaratory Act, claiming the authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me in this episode. I hope you learned a little bit about the Stamp Act Congress. I hope you could kind of see the shadow and the shade of what will come in the future as colonial delegates will meet in the talks for independence, for the Articles of Confederation, for the signing of the United States Constitution. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up. It really helps me out in the algorithm. Comment your thoughts below. What did you think? Did you hear names that were familiar to you before? And it's going to get a whole lot more volatile from here. I mean, the Stamp Act was truly just the beginning. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next episode. Bye.